Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the State of the Black Church. My name is Reverend Andrea Guilford Jr., and I have the pleasure and privilege of serving as the president of Yale Black Seminarians for the 2023-2024 school year. And it's been such an honor and privilege to serve with these illustrious individuals who consist of preachers, theologians, journalists, ethicists, environmental activists, so many individuals who are part of Yale Black Seminarians, and it has been a significant joy. So I'm greatly privileged to be the president, but also be the president of this organization during our 55th anniversary. Just go ahead and give a round of applause for YBS 55 years. I was having a technical difficulty in that I was trying to find the, here it is, right here, the bio of our moderator. We are really in for a wonderful treat today. We are having individuals who are notable in their own right to give us some perspectives around the Black church. We wanted to have this panel discussion to commemorate the 1935 summit that occurred here on this campus. It was a band of Black, at that time, only men, who gathered together and wanted to try to figure out what is the trajectory of the Black church, socially, economically, politically. What are the ways that we as a Black church can strive for better? What are some of the gaps that we need to fill in? So that band of Black men who were clergy, sociologists, came together. Those sociologists and clergy and Black men included Benjamin Mays, the soon-to-be the president of Morehouse College. It included Henry Proctor. It included many others. Adam Clayton Powell was in that group in 1935. So if they did it in 1935, we can do it in 2024 to think about the issues. The issues have, the more things change, the more things stay the same, right? The issues continue, and some of those same issues are still present in different ways, right? We have the inclusion of women and queer folks in leadership in the Black church. We're dealing with transphobia in the Black church. We're dealing with Black churches, historic Black churches, closing their doors because of the COVID pandemic, the COVID pandemic causing grief amongst Black clergy people or Black clergy people, Black pastors being burnt out in significant rates, causing suicide rates to go through the roof. There are so many issues that are affecting the Black church, and we are here to talk about those things. And we want to ask you to be a part of that group, a part of that conversation in very real collaborative ways. We believe that everyone in this room has stories, has expertise that are valuable. So this goes back to our theme. This is our story. We are all part of a larger story, and each of our individual stories make up that larger story of what it means to be God's beloved. So wanted to take a moment and give you that background while we're doing this for this time period. Want to also take a moment to introduce our moderator, and she is none other than our former president. She is my predecessor as YBS president. That is Minister Lindsay Arrendell. So just to give a brief introduction to her, she is a preacher, writer, entrepreneur, and Emmy Award-winning journalist, believing in storytelling as a powerful tool for healing and change. Whether she is in the pulpit, the streets, the classroom, or on stage, Minister Lindsay Arrendell leads with love to connect with those around her. She is currently researching how Christian women have navigated having abortions with the goal of creating a pastoral care guide and spiritual care guide informed by their experiences. She is a published author, and she has a new book coming out called Mind the Unseen, explores abortion as a pathway to healing while navigating the reality of choosing to have an abortion as a Black Christian woman in America. She is a graduate of Yale Divinity School, class of 2023, with an M.Div, and she currently serves at the Double Love Experience Church. Her pastors, go ahead and raise your hand. Pastors Wilkes. Well, oh, Gabby not here. Okay. Under their leadership, pastors Andrew and Gabby Wilkes, where she will be ordained in November 2024. Amen. I was there for her licensure, so we are so excited for her. She answered her call to ministry in May 2019 while working as a journalist for NPR affiliate station, Hartford, Connecticut. Originally from Washington, D.C., Minister Lindsay preached her first sermon as a teenager during a youth service Sunday at Zion Baptist Church. An accomplished entrepreneur, Minister Lindsay brand Gloss Rags gained notoriety for the And Counting Collection, a series of apparel that memorialized Black folks slain by police and racists. The collection, which debuted in April 2014, featured over 30 sisters and brothers, was laid to rest in 2018. Essence, Fast Company, The Fader Complex, and other outlets have all covered Gloss Rags. She is, and we can't forget this, she's the daughter of the newly minted Reverend Donna and Edward Carlton, II, the granddaughter of the late Patsy Lee and Stanley Jenkins and Barbara Lee and Edward Carlton I, the sister of Edward Chad and the mother of two angels, Joy and Mercy. She also auntie to three wonderful humans, Maya, Calvin, and Naomi. The scripture for Lindsay's current season of life is Romans 12:12. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. Let's give it up to Miss Minister Lindsay Arrendell.
Thank you, Reverend Andre, and thank you all for being here today. I do want to start with a word of thanks. It is not lost on me that we are sitting in the presence of elders who, if it were not for their labor, for their voices, for their persistence, we would not be here. And so I do want to just applaud both our esteemed panelists, in particular Dr. Angelique, Dr. Stephen, also Dr. Streets, who's in the number, Reverend Jennings, our elders who are here, if we can just give them a praise of thanks. We are so honored and grateful for all that you have contributed and actively continue to contribute, so thank you so much. We are here today, and we are glad to be here. It's a joy to be here. It's a joy that the Lord woke us up this morning, amen. Amen. So how this is going to go is I'm going to read off the fantastic bios of our esteemed panelists, and then Dr. Angelique, who is an expert on the global state of the Black church, is going to bless us with some perspective, and then we'll join together in conversation. Is that all right with y'all?
Yes, all right.
All right. So the Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith is a senior associate and strategist for Pan-African and Orthodox faith engagement at Bread for the World in Washington, D.C. She brings extensive global, national, and local experience as a faith and public engagement thought leader, journalist, speaker, broadcaster, scholar, preacher, and author. This past November, she debuted her book, Ahead of Her Time, Pan-African Women of Faith and the Vision of Christian Unity, Mission, and Justice, published by the World Council of Churches. In September 2022, she was elected president of the World Council of Churches from North America, Turtle Island, at the WCC World Assembly in Karlsruhe, Germany in 2022. She also became the first woman from the historic Black Churches National Baptist Convention USA elected to this role. She is also the co-convener of the Pan-African Women of Faith and the Pan-African Women's Ecumenical Empowerment Network, known as PAWEEN, and Africans and the African Diaspora Africans in the Diaspora Network, AAD. She is the former executive director and minister of the Church Council in Greater Indianapolis, Indiana, Church Council in Trenton, New Jersey, and she was also the first woman to serve as president of Historic Black Churches of Christian Churches Together, CCT USA, and currently serves in governance roles with the National Council of Churches. President Bill Clinton, Senator Richard Lugar, former Indiana Governor, Vice President of the USA, the Honorable Mike Pence, and two of her alma maters, Yale Divinity School and Kent State University, have awarded her with high distinctions of leadership. Recently, she was awarded the Shirley Chisholm Award from the Conference of National Black Churches, the Figel Award for Ecumenism by the Washington Theological Consortium in Washington, D.C., and she is a member of the inaugural class of history makers at the USA Smithsonian National Archive of Notable People of African Descent and a founding delegation of the new United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. She received her doctorate degree from Princeton Theological Seminary, her M.Div right here at Yale Divinity School, and a Bachelor of Arts degree from Kent State. On June 7th, 2024, this year, she will receive an honorary doctorate from the historic Wayland Baptist Theological Seminary, which began as a Baptist training union founded by free and enslaved persons in 1812. Let's give it up for Dr. Angelique. Reverend Dr. Stephen G. Ray is the Senior Minister of the Historic United Church on the Green here in New Haven, Connecticut. He began this role in the summer of 2023 after a long and distinguished career in theological education. Dr. Ray was the 13th president of Chicago Theological Seminary, a seminary that has ties to the United Church of Christ, and a past president of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. An ordained minister of the UCC, Dr. Ray has served as an assistant minister at Faith Congregational Church in Hartford, pastor of the Black Church at Yale, also known as BK, intern pastor at Amani Fellowship Community Church, UCC in Hartford, and Plymouth Congregational Church, also UCC in Louisville, Kentucky. Dr. Ray's academic appointments included the Neil F. and Ela A. Fisher Chair of Theology at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, Jeremiah A. Wright, Senior Associate Professor of African American Studies and Director of the Urban Theological Institute at the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, Associate Professor of Theology and Philosophy at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and lecturer at YDS and the Hartford Seminary. Dr. Ray received his Ph.D. in theology and African American Studies from Yale University and his M.Div, summa cum laude, we might add, from the Yale Divinity School. Among his awards are the Hooker Fellowship for Excellence in Theological Studies, Charter Oak State College Distinguished Alumni Award, Kentuckiana Metroversity, Distinguished Teacher of Adult Learners, 2006 Associated Church Press Award for Excellence for Column, 2018 Alumni Award for Distinction in Theological Education from Yale Divinity School, and Doctor of Divinity Honoris Causa, United Lutheran Seminary, 2020. A prolific author, his works include A Struggle from the Heart, The Black Community of Hartford, 1639 to 1960, Do No Harm, Social Sin and Christian Responsibility. In addition to his own monographs, he is co-author of Black Church Studies and Introduction, editor of the 20th anniversary edition of We Have Been Believers in African American Systematic Theology, co-editor of Awake to the Moment, Introduction to Theology, and a contributor to several other books, academic journals, and church publication. Dr. Ray has shared this wondrous journey with his wife of 39 years, Susan Paris Ray. Let's give it up for Dr. Ray. The Reverend Tasharah Y. Person hails from the vibrant city of Worcester, Massachusetts. Did I get that right?
Yeah, you did.
Hey, Worcester. The R is silent. Armed with a Bachelor of Science in Management Information Systems from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, she not only conquered the complexities of technology, but also discovered her calling within Belmont AME Zion Church, where her youth leadership illuminated the path ahead. After graduating May 2019, Tasharah set her compass for the pulsating energy of Washington, D.C., diving headfirst into the realm of data analytics as a senior software specialist at Unison Software Systems. However, the nation's capital held more than just career prospects. It ushered Tasharah into the embrace of Judah Temple AME Zion Church, guided by the venerable presiding elder Scott Seymour. It was there, against the backdrop of a new city, that she found her voice and answered the divine call to preaching ministry in 2021, and was later ordained as a deacon just recently in 2023. Restless in her pursuit of purpose, Tasharah has ventured into the sacred halls of Yale Divinity School, crafting the poetic verses of her M.Div. As young adult minister for Redeemer AME Zion Church in Plainville, Connecticut, she serves under the guidance and mentorship of Reverend Dr. Shelley D. Best, weaving her unique narrative into the tapestry of her faith. Beyond the pulpit, Tasharah's commitment extends to the broader Christian community, where she dons the mantle of treasurer for the Connectional Young Adults in Christian Ministries and virtual hosting coordinator for the Mid-Atlantic Episcopal District. Amidst the rhythm and work studies, she finds solace in the arts, exploring the world of illustration, dancing, and song. The journey continues, filled by passion, purpose, and an unwavering commitment to both technology and theology for Reverend Tasharah. Let's give it up. And lastly, Andrea. I knew I was going to do this. I'm sorry. I knew I was going to do this. Andrea Barton Reeves is the commissioner of the Department of Social Services for the state of Connecticut. Prior to her current role in state service, Andrea joined Governor Ned Lamont's administration as the inaugural CEO of the Paid Family and Medical Leave Insurance Authority, which she started from scratch during the pandemic. The program now serves over 100,000 people with over $400 million in paid leave benefits. Andrea has more than 20 years in leadership in both the nonprofit and for-profit sectors, and now mentors and supports a new generation of leaders. She is a TEDx speaker, chairs the board of the YWCA Hartford region, and has been named as the Power 25 Most Impactful Leaders in Healthcare Leaders by the Hartford Business Journal. In addition to her current roles in public service in the community, Andrea is a second-year MAR in ethics here at YDS, where she is a social justice scholar. Her studies and work focus on alleviating poverty. Let's give it up for Andrea. So we are going to move into the portion where we hear and get an overview of the global landscape of the Black church from Reverend Dr. Angelique.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All I have to say is things have changed a lot since 1983. That's all I want to say. Me and my husband arrived here as newlyweds. I was 22 of age. I can't even believe it. I was so young. And I come here now and I'm like, is this the same place I went to school? And also having served as a former Yale Black Seminarian president. Thank you very much as well. So it's good to be back here in this place of the humble beginnings of my young married life and my theological training after Kent State University. So thank you, Madam Moderator. I'm so honored to be in this amazing company on this day, and to the president, Reverend Andre. So this is just an overview that I put together that I thought might be useful in this moment. I keep a lot of company in the global space and have been since I left Yale Divinity School, having lived abroad and also traveled many places around the world, and in my new role as World Council of Churches president. So these are just a few comments that I would offer for thought as we're talking about, quote, the Black church. So I bring this theme, Black church, Pan-African and global, in our past, present, and future. This is kind of the overriding idea of what I'm seeking to present. In 2016, in my article entitled African Christianity and Historic Afro-American Churches, in the Anthology of African Christianity, I presented and penned these words at the outset of the article. In the book, An Unbroken Circle, edited by Father Paces Altsol, The argument is made that ancient apostolic Orthodox Christianity has gone full circle. From continent to continent, from Christ to his apostles, from the apostles to ancient Africa, from Africa to America and the Americas, and from Black Americans to their sons and their daughters. End of quote. The book proposes that there is an unbroken circle between ancient African Christianity before the colonial period and the Christianity of Africans who were and are, quote, Americanized. It is in light of this background I sought to demonstrate in my article that the independent and indigenous historic African American churches, or in this article was referred to as Afro-American Christian, Afro-Christian churches, are not only expressions of American Christianity, but also African Christianity, by virtue of an integration of African identity and the development and evolution of such churches. I go on to say that other churches, such as Afro-American churches or African-American churches associated with the Roman Catholic Church, Orthodox churches, and other Afro-American churches related to predominantly white Protestant denominational bodies, as well as recent African immigrant churches, and a host of smaller historic and indigenous Afro-American Christian movements in the US are also included in this argument. Recently, in my new book, Pan-African Women of Faith and the Christian Vision of Unity, Mission, and Justice, I refer to this ancient and more recent legacy as part of a Pan-African and global Christian lens for a more globalized understanding of what has been called, quote, Black church identity, as cited by scholars like Mamiya and, of course, Lincoln. I cite the Pan-African movements that were aligned with ecumenical history and Pan-African women, her stories, as a way of rewriting the narrative of, quote, Black church, not only in the United States, but globally. In this moment, this globalized understanding of our ancient, recent, and Afro-futuristic destiny will be urgent and especially important for us. One glaring example of this was my engagement as a third-term delegate and speaker at the side events at previous global advocate of what is now called the United Nations Permanent Forum of People of African Descent, whose genesis began in 2001, not in the Americas, but in Durban, South Africa. The Durban Declaration of People of African Descent is still required reading for anyone interested in addressing both the challenges and global recommendations concerning race, racism, gender, Afrophobiaism, and related domestic and global intersectional issues, as well as the historic and colonial root causes of the horrific, even hellish, legal and moral injuries and harms on people of African descent that we still face today, as we look at issues of the wealth gap, which is 8 times over what it is for white families on an average, for some figures based on scholarship. This movement, among many other movements that are multi-religious, ecumenical, and otherwise integrated spiritualities, particularly of African heritage, is quite important. The good news is that scholars like Lincoln and Mamiya and Al Rabateau remember the, quote, Renaissance years of a kind of African and people of African descent Reformation period of the 1700s to the 1900s in the US by naming the years of 1794, 1870, 1796, 1880, 1897, 1915 as years when Africans and their children of African descent, here I underscore both Africans and children of African descent, initiated alternative pathways of global import, not only in the US, but globally. These churches, of course, are the years in which we acknowledge, quote, the historic Black churches being formulated that Lincoln and Mamiya referred to, where relationships of mission work of these churches with our kindred globally were at the heart of their charters. National Baptist Convention, for example, was founded, concentrated on not only home missions, which I'm a board member, by the way, and also foreign missions was centered to the charter, for example. That is also the case with the African Methodists, the African Methodist Episcopals, and the list goes on. But more than this was also happening outside of the US, with and without the engagement of these churches, with indigenous agency and historic design. This in addition to the ancient presence of African Orthodox churches and other churches, we have an important Pan-African legacy to engage when we think about the global ancestry of who we are. Scholars like our own Reverend Dr. David Daniels from Yale Divinity School tells us this legacy was influential over 500 years ago in the Eurocenter Reformation taking place. In 2017, Dr. Daniels' presentation and subsequent conversation on, quote, the honoring the Reformation's African roots was part of the panel presentation at McCormick Theological Seminary with a focus on unfinished business reimagining the Reformation. Here he states, quote, for, quote, Martin Luther, the Church of Ethiopia was the historical proof that his reform of the church in Europe had a clear historical and biblical basis. The revelation that Ethiopian Christianity possibly had links to Protestant Reformation is a game changer for what is generally thought to be an exclusively European phenomenon. By recognizing the contribution of Ethiopian Christianity to the Protestant Reformation, a Eurocentric Reformation, we can join Luther in acknowledging Ethiopian Christianity as a forerunner of the Protestant Reformation as well. Today, in places like the Sudan, where I lived after leaving Yale Divinity School, in Darfur, in the deserts, I might add, in an Islamic society, and where the power and agency of Sudanese women brought down what was arguably a brutal, non-democratic government, where now, even today, 25 million stand on the verge of starvation. We also recognize that in Sudan, we know that the Black church expression has ancient roots and is helping to keep the people alive. Places like Ethiopia, where the horrors of conflict, and places like Tigray and Haiti, where Black church expressions are keeping people alive with the hope of the great legacy of them being the first Black republic in the world that has roots of faith, of Black church identity. Black churches have participated in recent days with the solidarity and support of the Caribbean government, the governance entity of what is called CARICOM, which gets little attention and little regard as it ought. But it is CARICOM that is convening with people of faith and at the grassroots and in the government entities to bring about what we hope and pray will be a transformational moment. Having just left the UN where these discussions were underway, we are very hopeful that this is possible, and Black church community is in those conversations. Or in Gaza and Israel, where the legacy of Black and brown Jews and Palestinians is not often recognized or acknowledged. Or the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the civil war has lasted more than 20 years. Even in this place, we have roots of ancient Christianity in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Not just the missionized moments that are often lifted up in Eurocentric teachings. Or if we look at the US, where the rise of white Christian nationalism and religious nationalism, generally speaking globally, has increased its energy against all. We know it is Black churches. If you just looked at the New York Times article that came out, full-page ads of all these churches of Black church leaders saying no to Christian nationalism and to the issues around Gaza. Or the dramatic presence of climate change crying out for climate justice globally, but with inclusive regard for our Pan-African brothers and sisters, not only in the transatlantic, but in the Pacific. Black church expressions are giving a sense of hope for our brothers and sisters in the Pacific. Not only there, but also in Africa and our Black farming and urban communities, where Black churches often gave the donation for not only our burial grounds, but also gave the donations for Black farmers to exist. And now we have the Black Church Food Security Network, which is recovering some of that history. At the same time, we have concern for what the All Africa Conference of Churches, where I keep a lot of company these days, is calling what is called misleading theologies. Theologies that focus on self versus the great commandment found in scriptures like Matthew 22, 37 to 39. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. All these very brief observations bring me to the following observations and recommendations for further thought, for the present and for an Afro-futured global direction. One, we're invited to rewrite the narrative of the, quote, Black church. within global Christianity and with the Pan-African lens. This is not only a historical exercise of integrity, but also an exercise that invites recognizing, embracing, and knowing our Pan-African kindred for fellowship, empowerment, and movement. Number two, therefore, quote, the Black church is not and was not only domestic, but global and Pan-African from its very birth. Number three, we are invited to rewrite the narrative of women of Africa and African descent. Since the biblical and ancient days, we know that women have been a part of this story. And not only following, but leading. This is critically important to understanding our future and our present. Also, we must engage the global secular world. And we must remember that we are a Sankofa people of Africa and of African descent. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, what it was, what is, and will be, but every season demands discernment of what are signs and wonders and challenges for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Angelique, for that wonderful primer to really set the stage for this conversation. So the Q&A is going to happen throughout. So I'll pose a question, we'll engage the panelists, and if you have a question related to the question that was raised or something that was stated, please raise your hand and we'll have our mic person come around. But also, as a journalist, I want to remind you that a question is a question rather than a comment. I mean, we do want to engage in dialogue, but let's if you do have a remark, in addition to your question, let's try and keep it brief. Amen? Amen. Okay. So I want to dive right in. I want to ask the tough questions, partially because, so I had the opportunity to go to the Proctor Conference in 2023 when it was in Atlanta. And one of the things that Reverend Dr. Melva Sampson said in one of the general plenary sessions was that just rather simply, but really profoundly, that people are dying. Every day in this country, people are dying. Every day overseas, people are dying. You raise the folks that are on the brink of famine and starvation in Sudan. So I want to ask to each of you, where do you all see currently, presently, the Black church coming up short?
Well, if I could begin by saying that I want to reframe the question. And why I want to reframe the question is that frequently the study of the Black church outside of the explorations of the sociologists of the field have presumed some sort of deficiency in the very thing itself. So the question has always been, how has this institution, which is a mirror of a larger institution in white society, in its own sort of way ingenious, but notice it's not way ingenious of the church itself, but rather of itself as a reflection of this larger thing. So I want to change the terms of the conversation from looking at Black deficit to looking at what the church is challenged to do. So two things I want to say, and I won't promise to be brief, but I won't be long. So two things I want to point to is that the continuing reality of systemic racism that has embedded itself in residential segregation, that has embedded itself then in economic exclusion, that has then embedded itself in intergenerational transmission of disadvantage, means that most Black churches have as their primary role the survival spiritually and physically of Black people. The image I use in my mind is that the majority of Black churches, at 60, 70%, they are like a triage unit in the midst of a battlefield. So they have people coming to them wounded, but here's the point, is that it's not like they've come back from the battlefield, but the people who were wounding them are continuing to wound them even as they're being triaged. So in the vocation of helping restore Black people to wholeness so they can deal with Monday morning, as we used to say back in the day, so that they could deal with Monday morning. I think the Black church has been exemplary in that role. But the problem is that the well-being of Black people as such has such a diminished role that doing that work well doesn't count for doing work. Right, so even though you're healing and continuing to give hope to vast millions of Black people who are facing all of the challenges of this sort of systemic racism, isn't counted as being a success. So as a consequence, what that means is that the church is always working at a deficit. And so that's why I wanted to reframe it. The second piece that I want to lift up is that in terms of when we talk about the Black church, and I want to lift up and give nod to my esteemed colleague, when we say Black, whatever Black means at the moment is what the Black church is, right? So 50 years ago, the Black church was primarily the institution of the Scions or of the Southern migration. So the Black church music, everything was simply the South transplanted all throughout the United States. When we say Black today, on the other side of being African Americans, right? Because the African Americans, there's still a few of us around, but we're dying out. We're going to be gone in about another 15, 20 years. But there are going to be Black folks. Black means something different than it did at the rise of the age of the African Americans. And what Blackness means is necessarily diasporan. What Black means is necessarily multicultural. What Blackness means is necessarily an expression of Black genius and creativity that ties together the entire Atlantic world. And not just the Atlantic world in terms of America and in terms of Africa, but the Atlantic world in terms of America and South America and Central America. So whatever Black means, that's what the Black church is. And whatever the Black church does to help those Black people survive, because these realities aren't changing, right? So one of the things that people who were immigrants from Jamaica, right, once they had Jamaicans, the Jamaicans realized that, well, you know, we don't have a home to go to. This is where we're from, and all of this crap has not changed. And similarly, but the last point that I want to make is that one of the things in terms of looking at the Black church in terms of its deficit and talking about it primarily from the vantage point of deficit loses sight of the fact of one of the primary vocations of the Black church was creating through the formation and shaping of its daughters and sons the moral conscience of this nation, as well as the leaders of the nonprofit world, as well as private industry, in ways that would humanize all of them. So that's not a small thing, because to the extent that the daughters and sons, and one of the things that it's not as true as it was, but up until at least the first decade of this century, most Black people who went to college grew up in church. If you look at the if you look at the stats from UNCF, so what that meant was that the people who would go on to be thought leaders, the people who would go on to be industry leaders, the people who would go on to be leaders in the nonprofit world, the people who would go on to be leaders in the world of communication, were people who had been shaped. So that's a part of the gift of the Black church as well. So all of which is to say, I want to reorient the question away from what is the deficit, because that's the presumption about Black folk in general, that we are simply a shadow of the rest of the world. So we're always operating at a deficit, to look at what both our vocation and our success in that. So thank you.
Turn to your neighbor and say, neighbor.
Neighbor.
Oh, neighbor.
Oh, neighbor.
Class is in session. I just want to briefly say, when I was thinking through this question, but I want to stay on the thread that you offered us so graciously. I was thinking through, the conversations that we continue to have and the prevalence of what we call church hurt. And so I was sort of thinking about how, in many ways, of course, the Black church can be a place of healing and of restoration. But for many, the Black church can also be a place of deep wounding. So we can pivot to that in just a little bit, but I want to stay on the thread that you offered us, Andrea.
So thank you, Dr. Ray. I don't, and I too agree with the reframing. I don't think the Black church has really ever had the luxury of falling short. We've always had to step into the, I would call it not just a gap, but this just chasm of indifference that we face a chasm of indifference that we have faced as a people, and the constant deficits that we have had to overcome. I wish that Black churches had the luxury of just being a place of spiritual nourishment, but we've never had that luxury to only serve in that space. We have had to heal wounds, we've had to feed people, we've had to clothe people, we've had to teach our children, we've had to be a place where we have to really shield our children from harm and be a place where they can heal when they are harmed because they have gone to segregated schools, because they live in segregated communities, and even because they are going to a school where 50 miles from where they go to school, those children are going to a school that is an award-winning top 10 school in the state, and 50 miles away, the children are going to school where literally the letter of the name of their school has fallen down that morning. So we're talking about these enormous inequities, and our Black churches step into that space all the time. And we see it particularly during the pandemic, when finally, I think many state governments recognize that faith-based communities, and I use that term very, very broadly, really had enormous value when they found that when states and the nation itself found itself overwhelmed in meeting need that they were just discovering, but we always knew that that need was there. We always knew that that inequity existed. We always knew that the health inequities existed. We always knew that the educational deficit existed. We always knew that the technical divide had always existed. And then suddenly it was discovered that the Black church could pivot and fill in. But we are not just filling in, we have always filled in and uplifted and enriched and made space where no space was ever made for us. So I'll tell you a story. I was very recently speaking at an event where one of our larger hospitals in the state opened a center for racial trauma. And the doctor that's running the center said, I'm going to use my scientific background and my considerable academic credentials to apply what I know and what my staff knows to racial trauma. And I said to him, that's laudable, that's really wonderful, but I want you to understand there were already centers for racial trauma before you got here. Right, and those centers for racial trauma are the Black church. This is where we went. It was my grandmother's front porch. It was our dining rooms. It was our basements. Those centers already existed because they were not scientific centers. Because they weren't run by folks that had M.Ds and other degrees did not mean that they were not effective and that they weren't doing real work in healing. So I said to him, Doctor, I appreciate and respect all of your credentials, but you have to know healing happened before you got here. And if you want healing to continue to happen, you need to partner with the folks that have been doing this work long before you arrived. And that is really, I think, the nature of the Black church that doesn't operate in deficit. It actually operates and thrives in ways that I think many people couldn't even begin to understand how we do what we do with so little of what we have.
Amen.
Acknowledging the reframing of the question. I believe one thing that the Black church is challenged by is...
Matthew's on it, everybody. He took off running. Give us just a moment.
One thing the Black church is challenged by is this seeming perpetual identity crisis. And what I mean by that is we're so deeply wounded by Eurocentric Christian miseducation that we've come to adopt it within our own personal theology. So much so that we have become complicit in our own oppression within the church context. People are not living free and liberated within their own selves. And so I believe a solution, and I'm being vague, but a solution is having real open conversations about issues that are very relevant and real within our current world context, incorporating theology and theological discussion with what we're actually experiencing in the real world, how the world has been shifting. It's very different from 200 years ago. I mean, I'll use an example. I know my denomination well, and we're founded on doctrine, and it's very much political. We have structure and polity that is, to be candid, quite outdated. But we have leaned on that so heavily because, it has helped us through difficult times back 200 years ago. But now it's really not helpful to those of us who are living in 2024. And so unfortunately, we're burdened by the pressure to want to stay true to our history and stay true to our tradition, which is so rich and so valuable. However, I believe that we do ourselves a disservice when we do not allow ourselves to shift as a result of our ever-changing world. And that's all I'll say to that for now.
Dr. Angelique, would you like to offer any remarks?
I've said a lot already. I'll let them go.
All right. Thank you so much. And so I want to stay on some of the things that you raised, Reverend Tasharah, and as a woman recently ordained in the AME Zion tradition, where do you see areas for growth? Where do you see areas for opportunity?
Well, I have a list. I believe a great place to start is by having some real open, candid conversations with multi-generational perspectives and experiences, taking into consideration various experiences, life experiences, various contexts. As I speak, I'm grieving for my church. Deeply grieving. And this week has been a very difficult one. A recent issue is there has been all right, I'm going to be real. Is that all right? Okay. So, my mentor and dear friend of mine, radically liberal Christian, and so in the AME Zion Church, we have a position known as the deaconess. The deaconess, they serve communion. They help to serve communion. So they wear their all white, they wear their doilies, and so they're there on Sunday, the first Sunday morning, and they help out serving communion. According to our discipline, the deaconess, it's a position reserved for women. And so my mentor, the pastor of the church at which I was serving as prior to Monday, she consecrated a transgender woman as a deaconess. And over the last couple of weeks, it has absolutely exploded throughout the denomination in a traumatic, tragic way. The leaders of our church have acted on her decision to consecrate this transgender woman as a deaconess. And the decision that was made as of Monday was to nullify the consecration, one, and then two, to lift her appointment from the church. She is no longer serving as the pastor because she acted in love to allow an individual who had a passion for serving God, for loving God, but because of how she identified, she was not allowed to serve there. And the leadership that acted in love is now facing consequences. And so I'm grieving. I'm grieving because I'm personally affected. And I'm also grieving my church. And it's easy to get angry at the institution. But as I was alluding to before, we've become complicit in our own oppression. We are not allowed to be our whole selves. Everybody's dealing with something on the inside, and they're not allowed to fully experience that. They're not allowed to bring it to the church, the hospital, where God is supposed to be the one to doctor them back to health. They're not allowed to serve there. And so I'm grieving because we are not allowed that space to be free. The AME Zion Church is the freedom church, but we're not free. And so there is so much room for growth.
Thank you for that. I'm thinking about a remark, and I'm coming to the question in just a moment, about we were at a conference called Flourish and down in Atlanta, and one of the refrains was that free people, free people. And so that is a hopeful statement and declaration in this day and age where Dr. Shelley Best, as a free person, was seeking to free someone else through that appointment. And I think, there's times where we're seeking to move the ball forward. We're seeking to not just, we're seeking to put into practice what is said to be free in theory, right? Like in theory, if we can ordain women within denomination, let's put that to the test. Let's see if this is actually as free as you would want to believe it is in theory versus in practice. So thank you for your vulnerability, Reverend Tasharah. And we sit with you in that as well, in that grief. Let's all just take a deep breath, maybe. And an exhale. We have a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is that on? No, now it works. The question is more related to the first part of the discussion, first question. And I like the rephrasing of a question, but I'm wondering whether we couldn't go a step further, and I'm doing that from an outside perspective in a double sense. As you see, I'm not a person of color, and I have to say what I experience here at Yale Divinity School and also around where I go to churches and so on, I get almost jealous that I'm not a person of color. You have such a vibrant community in church, but also in another sense, I'm European. So that is the second or third time that I'm here in the United States at all. I'm here a visiting fellow, but I'm based in Belgium, a professor there for church history in Leuven. So it's from a European, not people of color perspective. And it's a meta question, because we are speaking here about black churches. And I'm wondering why I never thought myself as being a member of a white church. And well, in our church, we have people from Asia, we have people from all kind of backgrounds. I never, okay, white people are the minority because that's the case in Belgium. But yeah, it just didn't come up in my mind. And from a biblical theological perspective, I'm wondering whether color is an ecclesiological criterion at all for categorizing and segregation. So if we look into the future of a black church, should we speak about the future of a black church, or should we perhaps speak about the future of churches? Why? Yeah, you see, I'm coming from the outside. Why keeping it that way, or taking it just for granted that black churches are black churches, and we speak about the future of black churches instead of the future of churches, where we have black and white and color and everything.
Yeah,
So
Dr. Ray?
Oh, God. So I am not a scholar in this space at all, but I think I will respond to you as a person who has attended a black church her entire life, and appreciate your vulnerability in the question that you posed. So I will say this from my perspective, and perhaps my fellow panelists will share this as well. It is not just a matter of the color of our skin. It is really a reflection of our experience as a people. And that is why the Black church has the very specific definition that it does. It is a reflection of the experiences that we have had from the moment that we landed on these shores and the oppression and the horror that we've experienced individually and collectively and continue to experience because of our race individually and collectively. Each one of us could tell you a story of how we have been marginalized or underestimated or questioned with respect to who we are in our humanity, in our intellect, in our right to be in spaces where we think we can just show up as a person, and someone is constantly questioning whether we should be there or whether we should be at all. I'll also speak to it from the perspective of the mother of a Black son, and why the Black church is so incredibly important to me, because every time my son leaves my house, I pray that he returns. That is not an experience that happens in churches generally. It happens in the experiences of Black mothers who go to those Black churches to gain spiritual support, because we live in this constant space of trauma. So what you are seeing, the rising and the development and the sustaining of the Black church, is not just a place for us to worship. It is a place for us to be affirmed. It is a place for us to know that our humanity exists, and it continues to exist. And it's not just in relation to whether or not we belong here or not, is that it is a specific place of belonging and affirmation that we go to time and time again. And its vibrancy and its solidity, and I'm not going to think about the word that I want, but the fact that it has lasted for so long is a reflection of the fact that our experience as Black Americans has lasted that long in a space that continues to deny our humanity. That is why the Black church exists.
I think there's another dimension that, in terms of thinking about it theologically, so I'll approach it from that, is that, and I will admit, as I admit everywhere, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Calvinist, so I bring a strong Augustinian understanding of the fallenness of the world. At any given moment in epoch of human history, there are particular dimensions of the fall that shape human experience and society. In modernity, one of the most powerful dimensions of the fall is the category of race. The category of race creates an impossible absurdity, which is thinking that the church can escape the reality of a racialized humanity. And so what that means then is that if we understand that the operation of race has shaped every part of the world that was shaped under Western colonialism and under the transatlantic slave trade, so even if you weren't a part of the transatlantic world, you were infected by the colonial system that grew out of that. Understanding then the Black church as a response to that particular dimension of the fall in terms of the human spirit as well as the human desire and need for wholeness, then that creates an understanding of what it is that is happening in the Black church. Now, given that we exist in a situation that race becomes the inescapable term of our existence in modernity, then that means that that will necessarily be denominated as race and racialized when human beings come into the space of worship and formation of religious communities. So there's a significant sort of way that I always want to recognize that what the Black church is an exertion of humanity in the face of a particular dimension of the fall that has created what I call the impossible absurdity of the church actually being something that is above race, because that is simply impossible, because race is the term of humanity.
I would just like to talk about the functionality of the terminology Black church in the ecclesial space. All of the quote unquote Black churches have ecclesial names: the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the National, we go on, okay? So to be very clear, we do have ecclesial identity, but it is very important that we name our common narrative. And that's what my brothers and sisters are talking about, our common narrative. And having kept much company with Eurocentric expressions, etc., they too have common narratives. We cannot pick one over the other. Common narratives matter when we're communicating the gospel of Jesus Christ. Common narratives matter when it comes to humanness and humanity and dignity of peoples and groups. And if we don't name it, someone else will. And when someone else does, and we know how this works in a colonial society, it's not going to even oftentimes approximate what is real and what is meaningful. So it is very important that we name who we are, by who we say we are, which is we are Black, we are of African descent, we are of African identity, and guess what? God made it that way. And we're very happy with that. So I think it's very important we understand it's not only a reference of being, quote, Black church, but being African as a Methodist, being African as a Baptist, being African as Orthodox. Whatever it is, naming is part of the rite of passage to being Christian or any other faith identity we choose to claim.
So, you know, just one more piece is that last point is that Blackness does not sublimate theological commitment and ecclesial identity. Black Methodists really are Methodists.
That's right.
Right? They really are Arminians.
That's
Like I said, I'm a Calvinist, so I find them to be quaint and lovable people, but they just don't. They just don't have a clear view of the depravity of humanity, and they probably look at me and say, "You've been around white folk too long." You know, so it is. So I think, you know, that's an important dimension not to lose, is that Blackness does not sublimate theological conviction and ecclesial sensibility. Black Baptists really are Baptists,
Black Baptists
in their view of the world, right? Black Reformed folk really are Reformed in our view of the world. And Pentecostals really are Pentecostal in their view of the world. And so that's just an important point not to lose.
If I may just quickly say one other thing. One of the things that's really quite insulting, and I get this all the time, that oftentimes in ecumenical circles, everybody knows the Presbyterian Church USA. They say all of it. I can't begin to tell you how normalized it is that people cannot say the name of my church. The National Baptist Convention, USA Incorporated. And guess what? We're saying all of that because we couldn't be incorporated before 1880. Thank you very much.
Wow.
And how you have to teach about your ecclesial name.
Yeah.
And so your common narrative with your ecclesial identity must be spoken into, must be named, and cannot be misunderstood.
We're going to move on to the next question, but thank you for raising that. Pastor Gabby.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this enriching conversation. My question for all of you is, because the Black church is on the front lines globally of so many issues, how do you all keep yourselves abreast of what's happening both at your fingertips and across the globe? And what best practices might you offer for how you do a deep dive in educating yourself on issues, be it health, be it on trans women, be it on global work, be it on seminaries and local universities? We all have been in situations where in a moment's notice, we've got to get ourselves caught up to speed, and many of us fall prey to using the wrong sources to educate ourselves. Then we got to re-educate. So if you could just speak to the room about when you find yourself pressed against a wall, what are some of your go-to tactics, not only for domestic issues, but global issues that affect us, affect Blackness, and in particular affect Black faith?
That's a good question. So, I mean, I just have one thought, and I'm not meaning to offend when I say this. I mean, there are times I do mean to offend. This is not one of them. But recognizing very clearly that at least in terms of the well-being of Black peoples and Black communities, recognizing that because of the defect of its birth, evangelicalism cannot save black people. So what that means is in terms of church strategies, some very helpful strategies. So when you look at news sources, beyond looking at just, and I'm not going to go to Bart route and say the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other hand. I'm not going to go that route, but I'm going to say at least 4 or 5 web pages and websites that will give you an overview every single morning about what's happening in the world, and also being connected to the community in which you serve, but then creating some sort of network of theologians you can trust. And what I mean by theologians, I don't mean necessarily trained people. I mean anyone who is serving and trying to save the black community and save black people you can trust, and bring all of those together. And the reason why I began with what I said is that black folk are predominantly evangelicals. That's an inescapable reality of our existence. 70%, at least, perhaps 80% of black Christian communities, but they are not the voice of evangelicalism as a movement. And frequently we make the mistake of thinking that because our folk are predominantly evangelicals, that evangelicalism actually is interested, evangelicalism as a movement is actually interested in the survival of black people. So, practical thing, at least 5 sites that you visit every single morning. At least 3 or 4 theologians you can trust. And once again, theologians are people who are working to save black people in the midst of the faith. But always, always, always recognize that because people are speaking your language, it doesn't mean that they care about your survival.
If I can offer something, just having been a former journalist, there, like you were mentioning, there are websites. So for example, The Guardian has a whole African unit. And so that will provide, and the BBC as well, they all have their offshoots that are dedicated to Africa. There's another one, I have to remember the name. It used to be From Quartz, but they changed their name. But they have a lot of deeply enriching and not just insightful, but they really dig into the economics of Africa and how that's shifting. But I also think one of the strengths is that we can kind of connect the dots and see the similar issues, whether it's patriarchy or food insecurity or housing insecurity, like and how these uprisings are very much treated the same if we think about the students and the young folks that were shot at the, I think it's Lesotho Gate, not Lesotho, but the gate in Nigeria, right, a couple years ago. Or the disappearance of young girls in DC also happened in several African countries. And so the issues, the through line of the issues thematically tend to be the same. And so the ways in which we're raising our voices here can also be raised similarly. But I think doing the due diligence of every day, what are the headlines in Africa, right? Like, and then, like you said, finding some folks to be in conversation with. We had a visit from Bishop Vicentia, I think that's her name, in South Africa, and like opening a line of communication. I was like, "Are you on WhatsApp? Can we stay connected?" To learn from her and try and make sure that we're establishing these connections. And if I can just pivot. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Paween does and how that engages the work of the church globally?
Oh, I get to have a commercial, yay. I'm sorry, I didn't plant that. But I am a co-convener of what is called Pan-African Women's Ecumenical Empowerment Network, Pan-African Women. We've been together since 2013 in Busan, South Korea. Who knew? The Lord blessed us, and now we have a book and all the rest. But what that form, which goes back to what Dr. Ray was saying about having relationships and being in conversation, is that you get it directly from the women from DRC or Sudan. And I think that's what you want to do. Your ultimate strategy is to be in relationship to the places where things are happening. Because everything that comes to us through, I don't care if it's ABC, I used to work at ABC, I was a TV host, ABC, CBS, all that, it's filtered. And it's filtered, to be very clear, toward the people who are making money off your viewership. Let's be very clear about that. And that's also true with BBC, although I do listen to BBC and I do listen to Voices of America and all of that. I do try to go with more quote, unquote, people who are trying to follow more conventional journalistic approaches versus some of the more opinionated interests of money. So, but I think what you want is that directed relationship. And yes, you're welcome to be a part of Pauline. I have materials, I have a book, all that, and I'm glad to talk to you about that. But I think direct relationships. The other thing I would say is when you see a story about anything with our people at the center, like Haiti or Sudan, good news. There are people like us writing our own stories. And you're going to have to do some research. What is the name of the newspaper in Haiti, in Haiti? What is the name of the newspaper in Sudan? Now, it's going to be filtered through their own interests as well. But I tell you what, it may counter what you actually see in other filter sources. All sources are filtered. You have to choose which filter is preferential for you, and a lot of that has to do with the relationships you have in your ongoing work.
And that just reminds me, we heard from some Black Brazilian Christian women experiencing sexism within the church, and this was just a few months ago, and I thought I was able to kind of connect the dots of like, wow, we have these Black womanist texts that were birthed in America, that if we could partner and work with these women to co-educate, educate each other, then we can develop a global strategy for advancing womanism, but also helping them fight patriarchy and other forms of oppression against women in the Black Brazilian churches as well. So it is these sort of thematic similarities, but learning to treat each other at those direct sources and wells of knowledge so that we can come together for the greater good. I do want to...
I have one.
Okay, go right ahead.
Also wanted to note that, quick story, I had the pleasure of being at the Conference of National Black Churches consultation where our own Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith was honored with a legendary award. And at that conference, I had the privilege of being with a group of us who were doing work, emerging leaders in the Black church, and I met a brother by the name of Cesar, and he is from the Congo, and he explained to me what is going on in the Congo. Didn't know nothing about it. They're undergoing their own genocide right now, which oftentimes does not get a whole lot of publication, a whole lot of press, but it is really, really, really bad. So that relationship, these conversations we've been talking ever since December, caused me to go on my news outlet, which is Instagram. And yeah, Instagram. And Instagram has been so interesting for me because what I've found is that I can get some first-hand, first-person accounts of what's going on in the Congo. For some reason, CNN, MSNBC, I watch MSNBC on a regular basis, I watch ABC and all those places, they're not talking about the Congo, right? The Democratic Republic of the Congo. Why is that? So we have to ask ourselves the question. So I'm going on Instagram, and I find some photographers who have committed to taking pictures of the devastation in the Congo, and I was blown away. The same is the case for the devastation and the genocide happening in Gaza, right? I go and I find some photographers and some journalists who are in Gaza, who are taking pictures, who are sharing stories, and end up using in my sermon the story of a young boy who had been terrorized because his whole family was murdered in front of his face, right? Found this on Instagram, right? Now, mind you, everything is filtered, right? And we're also in this age of AI where things can be doctored and shaped to, have certain kinds of, to fit certain kind of propaganda. But I wanted to kind of talk about that, right? as far as the black church. My question is, what is the future of the black church in the realm of digital surveillance? How can the black church address, or what challenges are the black church going to face in dealing with this new level of civil rights, of digital surveillance, of data justice, where AI bots do not really know the full scope of the history, so we're relying on ChatGPT to tell us our history, and the bot doesn't really know the history. So what challenges are present there?
If I may, I just want to hold that question for a little bit down the line when we get to talking about the future of the black church, if that's all right. But I want you to hold that in your imaginations, hold that in your hearts as we move. So I just want to shift back a little bit, and while also pivoting. And so something you said, Dr. Ray, about the church often, and everyone pretty much has alluded to that, the work that the church does as a healing center, as a trauma center, and as an institution that we know with great humility that is not perfect. And so in pivoting, rather than asking, why has the black church been a place of wounding, I want to phrase it this way. What work can we do to address the healing that exists, right? People have church hurt. What work can we invest ourselves in so that the church continues to be a place of healing, a place of safety, a place of affirmation? What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Dr.
Well, we can do what the church has done from its very beginning, and that is to recognize that when particular bodies cease to have a vocation of healing for all who come and whoever will come, then there's a reason why the door swings both ways. Right, and from its very beginning, that's part of what the Reformation was about. That's part of what the sort of birth of Roman Catholicism was about over and against Eastern Orthodoxy. That's a part of what Eastern Orthodoxy, North African Christianity, over and against what was happening with the Coptic expression of the faith, is having the freedom to know that simply because we are not at this particular address, it doesn't mean we stop being church. And be empowered by the Spirit to create communities of healing, communities of hope, and just leave some of that other stuff to people who do church the way they do church. So I'm part of the black church tradition of the United Church of Christ. My church that I was ordained in, that I came along in, was founded in 1819. And it was founded because people were not going to move up to the balcony. The church that I grew up in was the church that was founded in 1879, and it was a church that was founded because people were not going to be treated as second-class citizens, right? When you look at Richard Allen, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones left because they weren't going to be treated like that. So all I'm saying is to recognize that a part of Christian tradition has always been that when the church at a particular address ceases to be a place of healing and wholeness, the Spirit calls some people to create a place that it can live once again as a power of wholeness. And that's, it might seem like a small glib thing, but it's not. It really isn't. Because if the church isn't doing what the church should do and helping people survive and helping people thrive, there really are other physical addresses that people can be at. And you're not a bad person for doing it, because that's what the church has done from its very beginning.
I'll be brief. I think it really just starts with having the difficult conversations, the conversations that nobody wants to have. that is a great place to start creating an open space. While you can't promise a safe space because people have varying perspectives and they come from different backgrounds, I think even just engaging in those conversations that inspires a place of at least where we can come together to support one another in our healing journeys. And then in that, taking action on how do we, respond to the cries of our people. It's really hard to pastor or minister to someone if you don't know them. So actually, it's quite impossible. So in order to get to know people, you have to speak to people. And so I think that just opening up the door for conversation is a great place to start.
So Dr. Ray, to your point about moving to a physical address, I think part of the challenge that we're facing in our current times is that number one, that isn't happening. People are just leaving. And second, they're moving to digital addresses. And so when you're moving into the digital space, there's a real challenge in building community and a single voice, or even trying to create an environment where sharing those differences of opinion and points of view are harder to share. But we find that as people are finding that they don't feel that they're in a safe physical space to share, then they're sharing digitally. And then it's harder for people to build a sense of even ecumenical community while they are doing that. And I think, Tasharah, your point is very real in that we need to have the hard conversations that when we get to a point, to what you discussed today, where people feel that what is happening in the world is bumping up directly against their own theology and their understanding of what Christianity is. And either they don't feel that there's a safe space for them to say, I don't feel comfortable having a person who is transgendered or a person who is gay or any person who I think is different from what my understanding of life is, be in my church space, and I don't feel safe to say that. And so therefore it shows up in different ways. But if we have a safe space for people to actually express this concern on one end, and I've seen it show up in ways of just outright distress, that people feel as if I make space for those that are different than me, that I don't understand, that is not part of how I was raised, and this generational divide that exists, that somehow I am not being faithful to the faith in which I was raised, my biblical understanding of what Christianity means. There is not a place for us to have that conversation safely and people not feel as if their beliefs are being challenged, and other people feeling as if there is no space for them to be included. That's the conversation I would say that we really need to have. And I see it come up again and again and again. And then we wonder why families don't come back to churches. We wonder, right, this is because there isn't a space for them to be families. They're defining it for themselves.
Yeah, I just want to go back to what Dr. Ray was saying about other addresses. I think we have to go back to the theological conversation about movement versus institutions, right? The Spirit does what the Spirit's doing. The Spirit is moving. The Spirit is opening our eyes in ways that make us uncomfortable. One of the primary motivations of the Spirit is to make you uncomfortable, is to take you places where you hadn't dreamt about and didn't want to go. That's Spirit. Now, institutions do some of that too, but institutions, I think, are more myopic and more grounded in the ordinary. Whereas I think Christians are committed to the extraordinary, right? We're committed to what is still possible, all of those things. So I think that whole conversation about spirit, movement versus institutions comes into play here. And I think it's important for us to make those distinctions. And you've got to ask those hard questions in your devotional life. In your devotional life. Yeah. And with your trusted entities. Who is leading me now? Is it spirit? Is it institutional? Is it myself? The whole I said Jesus thing. And you have to ask yourself that hard question. That's one of the reasons why I think a place like YDS has some value for us, is that it helps us to ask hard questions. And when we go back into the communities, we have to help them ask hard questions. Spirit versus institution versus ordinary and myself. Yeah. And that's where always the rub is. So I just want to encourage you to have that critical examination of how you're understanding what is coming at you from those lenses.
One of the things I'd offer up just briefly is these practices of accountability and courage. When I say accountability, many of us can think back to when there was really the shaming of whether it was unwed women or teenagers being brought and shamed in front of the church as if they created the baby by themselves. And I think a lot of the practices that the Black church that are deeply entrenched in patriarchy, deeply entrenched in misogynoir, there is a lack of accountability. Even, I am grieved that from many of my peers in ministry, women and women identifying, who say, I don't feel safe at this particular conference, or this pastor spoke to me in a particular way because of what I had on. And to me, that just screams a lack of accountability in terms of, are we walking in purity? Are we walking in righteousness? Are we holding each other accountable? Are we holding our assistant and associate ministers accountable in their conduct, right? And because their conduct is a reflection of your character, and our character ought to be informed by Christ, right? And so I think accountability in a church space can help churches become deeper places of healing, because we are people, right, at the end of the day. And then also I'd say courage, because my work is currently dedicated to creating space for women who've had abortions as Christian women to be able to bring their stories and bring their grief to the church. No judgment, no questions asked. And I think, and if you're in your church, it's important to know that the statistic is that 1 in 4 women have had an abortion and will have an abortion in their lifetime. And what I try and communicate to pastors is that you don't have to be the expert, but to say from the pulpit that we have space for you to be here and bring your grief and your wrestling even. Some women will always wrestle throughout their life as to whether that was a choice that can be forgiven, if that's a choice that God was okay with. There's going to be a wrestling, but the job, at least in my understanding, in my research, in my lived experience as a woman who's had an abortion, is that the responsibility and the charge is not to convince from a theological perspective, but the charge is to care. And so I continue to encourage pastors and want to meet with churches to say, when you open up space, healing can happen. But when one of the women in my research said that it was a silence, not that what was said, but it was a silence that informed her that she could not bring her grief to the church in that regard. And so that's something that I would offer up. We need to wrap up. So turning to the future, Andre threw out some really intriguing questions about AI, and we're also talking about this tension between the increasing hybridity of the church, having both a physical address and a digital address. What are your thoughts about the trajectory of the Black church as we are encountering many things both domestically and abroad?
I would simply say, you are the Black church. You. I mean, I agree, accountability matters, but you matter. And I just want to encourage all of you, and especially, if I may say so, those from the more recent graduating classes, the younger ones, because I'm old now, but the younger ones, claim your space. Claim your legacy. Be the sons and daughters of the amazing ancestral history that is yours. And not just look to, us old folk, like elders and people like that. Challenge us, engage us, and do it out of love. Because even as old ones, we're trying to do some things right. We don't get it right. We're falling, like Dr. Ray said. We're falling. But just very quickly, I'll just set aside. When I told my father I was going to Yale Divinity School, he kind of looked at me. It was a dead silence. He said, "Oh, you're going to seminary?" I said, "Well, yeah, Dad, I feel called to that." I sort of said, not to ordain ministry, because I wouldn't even think about ordained ministry or anything like that. But, my dad was like, "Well, I always knew you're going to be a missionary or an evangelist or, something like that, more conventional to the Baptist way, of course." And I said, "Well, okay." But he said, when he said, "But I met a woman minister in the AME church and seminary." That's what he said. He said, "You never know what God is going to do." Okay, now that was back then, before some of y'all were even thought of, I'm just saying. But I've lived to tell it. I've lived to tell it. I was feeling guilty. I felt bad about the idea of going to seminary. And then when my pastor said, I think you should be called into ordained ministry, he said that. I didn't say it. I was amazed. So I just want to say, especially for the younger ones in the room, hold on to the Spirit. Honestly, hold on. Have the hard conversations. That was one of the hardest conversations I had in my entire life growing up under the tutelage of my father, who was my pastor. But somehow I did it. And it really hurt me, because that's my father, that's my daddy. He loved me from birth. I had no questions about that. But it's those same people who do love you, but they haven't learned how to love you differently yet. Give them the benefit of the doubt that God's love is greater and the love between you can grow. Don't give up on us. Hang in there and be strong.
Only thing I have to say is, amen, amen, and ashe.
That's right. All right. Ditto.
Please, let's give it up for our distinguished panelists.
Amen, Amen, and Ashe indeed. Thank you again to these amazing panelists. Thank you to all those who are here in the room. We want to invite the Office of the Office of Development and Alumni Affairs, the Reverend Jake Joseph, who is, and Barbara Sabia, who has been incredible partners for YBS throughout this entire year. I want to just take a moment and let all of YBS Village celebrate the Office of Development and Alumni Affairs for all that you've done to help us. They have a special gift for the panelists. And as they come, I also want to shout out Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, who has a book that was just released in December. It is called Ahead of Her Time, Pan-African Women of Faith and the Vision of Christian Unity, Mission, and Justice, that talks about and features one of our own alumna, the Reverend Dr. Rena Karifa Smart. She's featured in this book, and her portrait is also in the common room, which is a fairly new portrait. So now we got three people, three black people in the common room. Amen, praise God. Taking up space. So we are so grateful for her. So she has her book, and I'll have some flyers here to share with you all if you are interested in her book and her work that is really changing the landscape about telling the story and the stories of Black, African women who are committed to the work of Black faith. Let's give these panelists again a round of applause. Our amazing moderator, Minister Lindsay Arrendell. Thank you so very much. So what we're going to do now is we're going to proceed outside to the lobby right next to Niebuhr through the little columns, the glorious columns in the lobby. There will be a breakfast spread out there, and then after that at 11:30 is our chapel service, our end of the year chapel service, where the Reverend Dr. Danielle McCrae, Associate Professor of Homiletics here at Yale Divinity School, and Reverend Tracy Russell, help me. Johnson Russell, thank you. Reverend Tracy Johnson Russell, who is a lecturer in the homiletics department, will be presiding over the Eucharist, YBS everything, amen? All right, thank you everyone, see you in chapel.